Welcome to Busted Speakers, I'm Cam.
I'm Alex.
And I'm Ed.
And today we're reviewing the 39th studio album by Bob Dylan, Rough and Rowdy Ways. This is his first album of original material in 8 years, after he spent the previous 5 years releasing albums of American pop standards, mostly songs that were performed by Sinatra at one time or another. His previous album of originals was 2012's Tempest, which people were afraid was going to be his last album, because it shares its name, sort of, with Shakespeare's final play, and that's meaningful, I guess.
It's meaningful to a lot of people who read a lot into hidden meanings or coded meanings with Bob Dylan.
Sure.
Yeah, and I guess why shouldn't they? Because that's very much been his lyrical style, kinda, since near the beginning of his career, if not the start. I mean, I've not actually heard the first 3 Bob Dylan albums, but I'm familiar with some from his, what many would regard his golden era, albums like Blonde on Blonde, Highway 61 Revisited, Another Side of Bob Dylan, etc.
Yeah.
So I'm just really glad that that didn't end up being the case, because the new album is, honestly, it's not one of his best in my view, but it's definitely in line with his legacy. It feels like an album that was worth releasing, and it feels like a Bob Dylan album in 2020 that makes sense to be that way. I didn't hear the Tempest album personally, so I don't know how much it differs from that one. But yeah, I was kind of getting a little bit of a this could potentially be his last album vibe from this one, honestly, not because of any reference in the title or anything like that, but just from the general vibe of it, it feels very much like he's looking back on his legacy in a way.
That really is a pretty clear interpretation for this album, just from the release of the first single and final track on the album, Murder Most Foul, a 17-minute epic centered around the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and he's just like constantly bringing in all kinds of literary references, all kinds of pop culture references, the kinds of things that like I wouldn't even normally expect from Dylan, like shout outs to the Rolling Stones and Billy Joel.
He was shouting out Alicia Keys on Modern Times, so I guess he's been doing this a few years now.
Oh, okay.
What I really liked about the way he used references on that song is that a lot of them had double meanings and like were almost used as puns in a way, but the song doesn't really explicitly make this clear, and I do feel like the song maybe is a little bit of a shot in the dark for the people who aren't familiar with the history, like myself, because obviously he's going into this like zeitgeist watershed moment in American history, and it's not really an elegy for JFK himself, but more an elegy for the history that proceeded to come in after that event, and you know, the cultural explosion that happened as a result. You know, he goes into the Beatles early on I think the second verse, and just spirals from there. But what I like about it is it sort of, without really referencing himself, it runs parallel to when he was, you know, rising to fame and creating that legacy himself. So it does definitely feel like reminiscence in the sense of, you know, everything that was happening around him culturally, but also the culture that he was a part of.
It's interesting because on his second album, The Freewheeling Bob Dylan, there is a song where he like speaks to JFK, like I Shall Be Free, where, you know, he's humorously talking as if he was there. So it's funny, he's looking back on it when he was around back at the time. It's just funny to make that sort of parallel. Like, this does feel like the end when that felt like the beginning. This is definitely his longest song, and I'm glad that it's like sort of separate from the album, because after the whole first 9 tracks, this is like its own thing. This feels like a separate EP to me.
Yeah, I agree 100%.
Key West is such a great closer anyway, but, you know, I could listen to Murder Most Foul on its own and get my Dylan kick. It's one hell of a thing. Dropping this was such a baller move, to be honest.
Yeah, and I love how he accompanied the drop with a tweet that just said, "I think you might find it interesting."
Yeah, that's putting it very mildly.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of have issues with the song in how sort of, like I said, it's sort of a shot in the dark in some ways. It's at times straightforward and also very dense It's dense with information, but straightforward in the way it presents it. And
Yeah.
it really helped me to have the Genius page open, constantly clicking on every single annotation so that I could wrap my head around all the references I don't understand, because I am a filthy millennial. I don't know about half the stuff he was talking about, and the fact that they're sort of indirect references a lot of the time as well. He's not just explicitly saying Marilyn Monroe, etc. He's doing it in a slightly more poetic way, as you'd expect. But for a Bob Dylan song, it is very straightforward, I think. Like, it's not especially coded, and the overall meaning, what you're meant to take away from the song, I don't think is clear either, which is not something I have a problem with, because I feel like people have had wildly different responses to that song, but it's very interesting. Bob was right about that for sure.
Yeah, he got it right with his tweet.
So there's the obligatory Murder Most Foul discussion. Shall we talk about the album now?
Yeah, all right, moving on. So it's a very interesting bookend with the opening track, I Contain Multitudes, which I believe was the second single.
Correct.
Yeah, and like both of these just like are probably the most dense with the literary references and pop culture references, because like the title of it and the, I guess, one-line refrain of the song is lifted from a Walt Whitman poem. Are you guys familiar with it at all?
I know Walt Whitman, but I actually wasn't aware of that. That's interesting.
I found that really interesting personally, just because I took a lot of literature classes in college, and I remember a lot of my classmates really didn't like that poem because they thought that he was just being incredibly pretentious and talking about, life in a way that just didn't seem genuine. And then the line that I Contain Multitudes is from says, "Do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes." Bob is just invoking that to, I think, represent the entire, like, at least the entire 20th century on Murder Most Foul, and then even, like, further back the whole history of, like, literature in a way on I Contain Multitudes.
Yeah, I also saw that song as like a really big self-reflection as well.
Yeah, it's definitely a self-reflection type song, this one.
Yeah, and in a way more direct manner than the closing track. I mean, there's multiple points across the album, especially on tracks like False Prophet, where he makes very explicit references to his own place in the history of music as an art form and the impact of his legacy. And while there's definitely a risk of him exuding a gross case of egoism with some of these lines, it really does come off as entirely honest to me. Like, because he also balances out those moments with a genuine acknowledgement that he's just a guy and he still has issues. It kind of idealizes self-acceptance in an old age more so than self-aggrandizement. And it's an acceptance of the good and the bad. He acknowledges his lifeblood draining away just as much as the power that it's had over the years. I wouldn't say it's like a Black Star, David Bowie level of abstraction in that regard, but it's clearly not trying to be. I wouldn't expect that from Bob Dylan because it's not his songwriting style from the albums I've heard. But it's as straightforward as it is densely packed. I'd say the lyrics are the best thing about this album, but that's no disrespect to the instrumentation either.
No, the instrumentation on this album is very lush, very warm, and just consistently really great. And I think by way of the standards pop album, the instrumentation on those albums was really strong, and this takes a lot from that, as well as the sort of tonal quality of Dylan's voice, definitely improved by way of crooning on those albums. So it's nice to see that continued here. I Contain Multitudes. This one's the most characteristic of Dylan's writing style. Like, for example, the song Highway 61 Revisited, off the same titular famous album. He lists a lot of different stuff and then summarizes them at the end of each verse with a simple "I contain multitudes."
Yeah.
In a similar way, he ends that song with the title. He likes to summarize things with the title at the end. I've noticed that throughout his career, and that might just be the way he likes to write, sort of poetic lines, and then stringing them all together in that way.
There's a very definite, like, Bob Dylan cadence on a lot of his songs.
Yeah. Like, he summarizes it himself. He says, "I'm a man of many contradictions. I'm a man of many moods." Like, that says it perfectly. Like, he's done so much over his career. He's gone through so many different eras and fins that might contradict each other, but he's just a man. He can't explain it fully, and "I contain multitudes" is summarizing it all in the best way he can, and he makes a really great song out of it too.
Yeah, I really love that song.
Did you notice on that song and a few others, I think Black Rider as well, there are no drums. It's just Bob's voice and some really atmospheric guitars.
They have this really wistful, airy quality to them, like they're sort of floaty in a way, and I really like
Yeah.
that about it. That the other Bob Dylan albums I've heard are nothing like that. So even though you do have tracks on here that are much more traditional, like 12-bar blues type tracks,
Yeah, yeah.
um,
There's a dichotomy between the more atmospheric, wistful, romantic songs
yeah,
and the free, more, like you say, 12-bar electric blues songs in False Prophet,
Goodbye Jimmy
Goodbye
Reed as
Jimmy
well,
Reed,
yeah.
and Crossing the Rubicon, yeah. So there's two different types of songs here, but the more wistful, romantic ones, some of them don't even need percussion or drumming. They just get by with Bob's voice, his words, and some, like you say, wistful guitars, and I really like that. There's nothing like that in his whole discography. That's kind of something new. There's nothing specifically like that. Yeah, there are songs with just him and his own guitar playing, like back in the day, and harmonica.
They're less rhythmic, if you get me. Like there is a definite rhythm to them, but it's a lot looser and it's a lot airier.
Yeah, like this album is produced impeccably.
Oh yeah. Honestly, I need to say about this. This is the first album I've listened to in a long time, and it's unsurprising that it's from Bob Dylan, but there's just so much space in it. Like, it's a very quiet album. It's almost mastered like a classic album, but
Yeah,
it still has the clarity that more modern equipment and production techniques would afford an album like this. But there's just so much room for all the instrumentation to breathe. And while it means we've had to axe the incredibly loud and some might say overbearing harmonica, I mean there is a harmonica on a song here, but it doesn't overpower the rest of the song.
yeah, one song, yeah.
Yeah, but
Even on Tempest, he had some more.
it would break the atmosphere too much, I think, if he just came in with that old style.
Yeah, it might have fit the more bluesy tracks, but even those songs didn't need it, really.
Yeah, I'm just really happy with how spacious this album sounds. It does feel like an old school approach to the dynamics, but yeah, with a level of dustiness and clarity that can only be achieved nowadays, really, which is kind of what I want from an album like this. I'm not expecting it to reinvent the wheel in terms of production or anything, because that's not really what Bob's about.
Okay, so do you guys have any other favorite tracks?
Like, almost all of them.
Yeah.
I feel like the songs that impressed me the most were My Own Version of You, I've Made Up My Mind to Give Myself to You, which is one hell of a title on its own. Key West as well, Mother of Muses. It honestly is like close to all of them. Crossing the Rubicon was probably the weakest, just because it's a solid blues, electric blues type song with very slow mountain riffs that accompany Dylan. Very bluesy, but it feels quite standard. It's definitely
Yeah.
a continuation of the bluesy tracks on Tempest, like early Roman Kins, stuff like that. So
I've got a question how much Crossing the Rubicon really adds to this track list. I think it would have actually benefit from it being cut with Mother of Muses going straight into Key West.
It probably would have been a less weird transition going from that, because it probably is the loudest, most raucous song on here.
Yeah.
Even more so than stuff like False Prophet. I'm used to stuff like this from Bob, so it doesn't bother me, but if you're definitely entranced by the airy production of this album, I could definitely see something like that breaking the mood.
Yeah, it's not just in that regard, though. I just think lyrically, it's just, like you said, it's kind of standard. I mean, songs like I Contain Multitudes and False Prophet obviously go into that self-reflection that's very hyper-contextual to this specific album at this specific point in time. But Crossing the Rubicon could have been on any Bob Dylan album, and if it was, it would have been one of the weaker.
That's true. It could have been on Together Through Life quite easily.
Yeah. But yeah, that's probably my least favorite track. If you take that out, I like all of them, honestly. But like Alex, I have some absolute favorites. I Contain Multitudes, we've talked about, is a great opener. When it dropped as a single, I wasn't as enthusiastic about it, but in the context of the album, it makes a lot more sense.
It's a great mission statement intro.
Very much so, yeah. And it gives that extra context that Murder Most Foul needed for me to enjoy that song more. And, you know, that's not my favorite here. I think it's a good song overall. It only really justifies its extremely long length just because of the amount of information that needed to be conveyed. I don't think it's an epic song in the sense of the instrumentation really doing anything special, you know. It's not Bob gone post-rock, guys.
No.
But yeah, the two tracks you mentioned, My Own Version of You and I've Made Up My Mind to Give Myself to You, definitely some of my favourite Bob Dylan songs ever. The former is just prime lyricism from Bob, like about him kind of constructing this figure, non-existent figure, in order to. At least this is how I read it, and I need to listen to this album more because I've only heard it 3 times, and I know that sounds like ridiculous. Like I've heard it 3 times, surely I must be familiar with it by now. But it's very dense. Like I highly recommend to anyone listening to this, please have the lyric sheet open, maybe on your second listen, because you're gonna miss so much. You're gonna miss so many neat little details. And with Bob Dylan's writing style, he does write in a coded way, but it's not like esoteric, really. It's like quite easy to figure out if you have it up in front of you and you give it some thought for the most part. Especially when each song has its own, you know, topic or theme, which is usually encapsulated in the title.
You can definitely have your own surface level of enjoyment of it without doing that because of how nice all of this sounds.
It's a very cozy, relaxing listen, and it's beautifully produced. Just sounds wonderful.
And honestly, his voice sounds really great. Like, if you listen to stuff like Together Through Life, how raw and rugged his voice was on that, I'd never think he'd be at this point 11 years after that album. So I'm just thoroughly impressed by how good his voice is here.
Yeah, I mean, he definitely sounds very old and weary, but like that he captures a lot of beauty in his inflections, and he has a very good deadpan sense of humor still. Like there's lines on here, there's deliveries on here that just make me laugh out loud, and I love that about Bob Dylan. I mean, I'll get into those two tracks in a sec, but this is the thing about Bob, right? We gotta talk about his voice, because in my experience, a lot of people will listen to him for 2 seconds and immediately be turned off by his cadence and the tone of his voice. But I think the best comparison I can make is why I like those recent Sun Kil Moon albums so much. They acknowledge kind of the reality of life in a very unpoetic way, and that captures a very unique and very real feeling beauty. And I think the flaws in Bob's voice kind of give me that feeling as well, because you feel his conviction through his lyrics. Like he's not the most amazing singer ever. He definitely hits the right notes, but like, you know, he has a very sort of broken voice in a way, and I don't mean that in an insulting way. I just think it's very down to earth and just nice once you get used to it. I mean, likewise with his harmonica playing, it's like extremely annoying to a lot of people, but I don't know, it just feels raw, it feels real.
I'd almost say his voice here is like almost as accessible as it could ever be.
Oh yeah.
Because yes, it does sound old and, you know, haggard a little bit on here.
It's not in your face like you could say, you know, Highway 61 Revisited is or whatever. And again, not an insult, but like it is a problem people have with Bob Dylan. But I think here, like you say, it's a lot cozier, you know? It's more accessible.
There's some songs on here where he straight up sounds poignant, and the only other time in his whole discography I've ever thought he sounded like that was maybe Nashville Skyline, just because he had a pretty sweet country inflection on his voice there. It was a bit more sweet and soothing. But otherwise, you know, he's always in your face. But I love his voice in general, in most instances of his career. But there's songs on here, like I've Made Up My Mind to Give Myself to You, where he sounds soothing more than anything else, which I never factored as a possibility with Bob at this stage in his career. Like in general, I'm just really thoroughly impressed with this album. It's definitely, I'm still amazed it exists, to be honest.
Oh, me too.
I'm just really happy with it.
And I'm not even familiar with like Bob's recent stuff, but I was not expecting, because this album is being incredibly well received as well. It's not just us who are, really celebrating it. Like, it's got a shockingly high score on Rate Your Music, considering. Pitchfork gave it a very strong review the other day. Not that I endorse Pitchfork, but whatever. But yeah. I need to talk about my two absolute favorites that I mentioned. My Own Version of You is like this kind of Frankenstein, sort of taking all these different disparate parts of culture, different references, different feelings, and putting them together to create this person. It's just a very interesting, like, song topic, honestly. I've not really heard anything like it. And then I've Made Up My Mind to Give Myself to You is probably the most beautiful song on the album. It's very much a strict love song, but I think it ties in with that sort of self-acceptance angle as well. Beyond the more dense existential songs, it's a song that could have slotted into his older albums lyrically, but it does have an extra layer of meaning if you take it with the context of him reaching a point of acceptance in his older age. But even ignoring that, it's just an incredibly sweet love song about giving yourself to another person unconditionally. And I was shocked listening to it for the first time, thinking this is just right up there in line with songs like, Just Like a Woman and what's that song called?
Visions of Johanna.
Visions of Johanna, yeah. I mean, when I say this is like prime Bob Dylan, I just mean like he's kind of at the top of his game in terms of doing what he does best. I don't think these are some of the best songs ever or anything, and they're not even some of his best songs ever. Because if you're going to weigh it up against his top tier material, you're putting it up against some of the greatest songs of all time, and it's just unfair.
Yeah.
You really just need to take this album for what it is in the context it was released. And that's not me saying, music these days sucks, you can't expect it to be as good as the older stuff. But it's a very sort of humble album in a way, I think. I don't think it's trying to be Blonde on Blonde 2020, even though it has that really ambitious closing track, which we've mentioned does sort of feel separate from the rest of the track list.
Well, he deliberately made it so by making it on a whole other disc when there was room for it on like the actual album disc, I think, right?
Exactly. Yeah. There was definitely room for it, but he put it on a separate disc. So, I think he intended it to be that way, as you say.
I think, being the traditionalist that he is, he was probably thinking about it as a vinyl release more than as a CD, and it definitely can't fit on with anything else on the vinyl record.
Oh, yeah.
So it's its
That's
own
true.
side D.
That's true, because Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands, I think, was its own side on Blonde's vinyl. So yeah, it might be. It's good to fit on one side of vinyl. That's true. Yeah, I didn't even think of it that way.
I think deeper into the track list, there's songs that are just generally enjoyable, and then there's Crossing the Rubicon, which, like I said, could have been cut. Key West is a good one. It's kind of just his ode to this, is it an island or a particular location?
Yeah, I read Key West as an island off the peninsula of Florida. I haven't heard of it that much.
It sort of, to me, came off as his sort of happy place, at the risk of sounding corny. Like he's singing about this place that he finds very cozy and sort of getting lost in thought. There is a cool vibe of him sort of getting lost in thought, and there's lyrics on the album that actually make reference to that, so he's fully self-aware of it. And I don't know if he's actually someone who sort of drifts away in thought like older people are generally characterized as doing, sitting in a chair and just getting lost. But when he uses that angle to frame some of these songs, it gives him a really interesting vibe as well.
I like how Key West has a sort of music box or a harpsichord in the background, which gives it a sort of idyllic holiday vibe to it. It definitely gives it a sort of paradise sound to me, and helps it sustain itself over the 9+ minutes it goes on for.
If you do want to take it as the closer, it's a great closer, I'd say.
There are some specific lines in here that, when featured on their own, stand out really strongly. On Mother of Muses, he says, "I've already outlived my life by far," which, on its own, damn.
Yeah.
I mean, this is Dylan commenting on his own longevity in comparison to other legends he mentions in the song, like MLK and Elvis Presley. You know, he's thinking like he's seen his life go by, and he probably does think that compared to some other people, he may have outlived his life by far. So, I don't know. That line really got to me for some reason. I didn't expect it, but then he's always speaking morosely or with death in mind. He's done that since the Time Out of Mind album in '97. So, like, do you guys remember the song Highlands from that album?
I actually haven't heard that album, sadly.
I haven't heard it in a long time.
There's a line on that album, and this is back in '97 when he was only in his late 50s, where he speaks of seeing young lovers and saying he would switch positions or swap places with any of those young guys in an instant if he could. And that was back in the late 50s. Like, the way he thinks about things and words stuff. Like, obviously this is getting to the core of why I love Bob Dylan so much, but the way he makes me think about things like that is unlike anyone else, and that just felt like another instance of that on Mother of Muses, which in of itself is another great song, but that line itself really spoke to me for some reason.
Like, I'm glad both of you guys really loved My Own Version of You and I've Made Up My Mind, etc., because those were also my favorites for pretty much all the reasons that Ed listed. You know, I'm a sucker for unique subject matter, and, you know, bluesy, folky Frankenstein is probably the most unique thing I've ever heard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, honestly, I probably would put I've Made Up My Mind to Give Myself to You among some of Dylan's best songs. It's like, I don't think I've ever heard anything this, like, achingly romantic, at least not this, like, you know, straightforward and romantic in Dylan's discography.
The arrangement is really stunning on that song, and you've got those backing vocals as well, which are just lovely.
Yeah, and it's, like, like, I think I'd also touched on this, it also kind of feels like a song about just, like, coming to terms with his age and, you know, the very likely chance that, like, he's not going to be here much longer.
Yeah, the way he faces mortality on this album, that's what was giving me Black Star vibes more so than, like, the sound of it or the way the lyrics are written or anything. He is very much a man who is facing death through his lyrics in a very poignant way that only a man of his age could do, and only a man with his level of experience could do. So this is a special album in that way. Again, it's no Black Star. Like, I don't even want to begin to make that comparison in any other way, but they do share that quality, which is definitely something to be celebrated.
All right. So, Alex, what would you rate this one?
I'm happy giving this a 9 out of 10. Essentially, it's everything I'd want from a theoretical 2020 Bob Dylan album. I cannot think of much more I could ever ask for in that capacity. Maybe Crossing the Rubicon could be cut, but I'm used to stuff like that by Bob of, you know, speaking of esoteric or actual places in his mind and going on wayward adventures in a weird bluesy fashion. So that song didn't mind me that much, but it does definitely detract from it being a 10 out of 10, which could have been possible. You've got Murder Most Foul on its end, which is his own adventure in of itself. You've got some of the most beautifully evocative songs he's ever written, I'd say. I definitely agree with you, Cam. Some of these could be ranked up there with some of his best. It's so hard to say because there's so many different aspects of his career to compare. Some of this might be easily comparable with some of his mid-70s work, like Blood on the Tracks or Desire, but it's hard to say. This is definitely one of his best late career albums. It's definitely sits well with a lot of his earlier albums. It's probably the best album I've heard from a 78-year-old. Keep an eye on that, though. I'm going to keep track. I'm going to review a lot of 78-year-olds on the channel.
All right, well, hold you to it.
It's a fair point, because Bowie was a lot younger when he passed, wasn't he? When he did Black Star.
Like 69, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. At the end of the day, I'm listening to this a lot. This is excellent. 9 out of 10. Like, Bob, he did it again. The old bastard did it again.
He sure did.
All right, Ed.
Yeah, I definitely have way less of a frame of reference for Bob compared to Alex, so I feel like maybe if I familiarize myself with his discography a lot more, my score for this could end up being higher. I'm sure there's a lot more cases of self-referentialism on here that would appeal to me more and that I would recognize if I was more familiar with his discography. But from the Dylan albums that I do absolutely love, Blonde on Blonde, one of my absolute favorite albums. Like, sometimes with an artist, I'll listen to an album and I'll know they have so many other great works that I need to check out, but I'll just get obsessed with that one album. And then whenever I feel like listening to that artist, I just listen to that one album. And I never get around to the other ones. I've been having...
With an album as expansive as Blonde on Blonde, that's definitely understandable.
Yeah, it's a very long album with a lot of different facets to it. This one's a lot shorter, a lot smaller scale, more humble, but it's also incredibly dense, like I said. It's a very poetic album. The lyrics are fucking great. Like, some of the best lyrics of the year. It's amazing that he can still write some of the best lyrics of any given year at this point. I don't know how this compares to his other late career material in that regard.
Pretty favourably, in my opinion.
Yeah, the way people are responding to it makes me feel like this one is very special, But I will check out those other albums eventually.
Yeah.
I do wish that it continued more in the spirit of the first 4 tracks beyond that, because I don't really love any tracks after that. Key West definitely comes close, and Murder Most Foul, I don't really love it as a song so much as I do as a document. While the instrumentation is very interesting, it doesn't develop that much in a way that, I want songs to develop that are that length. So it doesn't make it especially replayable. It's more of a curio. But what a fascinating curio it is, There's a reason we spent a bulk of the start of this review talking about that song, and we could have gone way deeper into it, but there's plenty of analysis out there if that's something you're interested in checking out. So yeah, I would probably love this album and give it an 8 if tracks 5 to 10 were, like I said, more focused, more in the spirit of the first 4 tracks. I think they're just on a more general, enjoyable level of quality that fits in with the instrumentation style of the whole album. He doesn't seek to reinvent the wheel on this one. It's definitely not the point of it. So if you're expecting some amazing, mind-blowing thing, don't. It's more impressive in just how straightforwardly great it is. So I'm going to give it a 7. Tracks 3 and 4, as well as the opener, some of my favourite songs of the year, for sure. And I really like the rest of it. And I'm really glad I checked this one out, because I almost didn't. Because, like I said, the singles, and some people out there might feel this way as well, in isolation, it was hard to fully get the sense of what he was doing with it, especially without a lyric sheet open. Again, I can't recommend that enough, having the lyric sheet up while you listen to this. Album cover's terrible. I don't mind the photo, but that typeface, man, no.
You can get the I Contain Multitudes single artworks a little bit better.
Yeah, I'd say so, but even then it does feel a bit, I don't know, it feels a bit cheap to me. I would have liked a more poignant album cover to match the quality of the music here. Like he says on I Contain Multitudes, just to wrap up, these are songs of experience, They can only come from his point of view, and that's what makes them so great. They have a wistful vibe of reminiscence to them, and he faces mortality both by looking forward and back, and that's great. The way he does it is brilliant. If this album makes one thing clear as day, it's that Bob's a guy who's reached a level of self-awareness that only a person of his age could find. I know not everyone's going to feel this way, not least the people who straight up hate Bob, but I honestly feel like he has every right to kind of big himself up like this. He's earned it. He has an expansive legacy to look back on. He's had a profound impact on music, and considering all that, he's incredibly humble about it on this album. And some of the more egoistic moments feel more tongue-in-cheek to me, like he's kind of goofing around and joking about himself. He still maintains the same brilliant deadpan humor from the older albums, if that's something you like about those. Because, like I said, my only frame of reference is those 70s albums. So the fact that I find so many frames of reference in those for this one is really good. Like, I'm amazed that he's still making albums like this. And yeah, I just love his lyricism. He spins pop culture references into his own unique mythology. He's very much a modern day poet, and this album is exemplary of that. I was not expecting to like this as much as I did. Yeah, 7 out of 10. Really good. Highly recommended.
And I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10. I really am not as familiar with Bob's 21st century music as I really should be. I've got the 60s and 70s pretty much down pat, but like everything from the 80s on up, I really need to familiarize myself with more. But having said that, I think that there was a lot of tension around the last like decade of Bob's, or the previous decade of Bob's career, because he was like so dedicated to releasing all those Sinatra albums that people were like genuinely worried that he'd lost the stuff, that he'd lost the ability to write his own evocative music. And I'm just so glad that this album came along to prove everybody wrong. Bob still has what it takes, even if maybe he relies on literary references a little too much on the album, quotes from poets and playwrights and authors. It's like, he's earned it. If anybody in the world has earned the right to, rest on his own laurels and other people's laurels, I think it's Bob. And having said that, the album does have some of his most evocative songs, in my opinion. It's just great hearing him, still going strong at his age for as long as he's been a figure in the music industry. Alright, and that does us for Rough and Rowdy Ways by Bob Dylan. Thanks for tuning in to Busted Speakers, everybody. If you like this video, consider leaving us a like. Subscribe if you want to see more of our album reviews. You can follow us on Twitter at _Busted Speakers. You can follow me on Twitter at SubProspector. And we will see you all next time. Bye.
Bye, guys.
Goodbye.
Goodbye!